The agenda began our 10th season this week with a look at the state of our education system in this province, considered the character traits of the 4 federal leaders, and weighed what Kathleen Wynne's support for Justin Trudeau might mean if Trudeau doesn't win. The agenda's week in review begins with seeking asylum. Is there any question in your mind that things are better for migrants when they arrive in a Western country, even if it's difficult, than where they came from? Is that obvious to say?
Well, the difficulty of the journey shows us just how terrible conditions are where people are leaving. And those are the pictures that we're not talking about. The 2 million people who've left for Turkey, the million who are in Lebanon, a country half the size of Hungary, the 600,000 in Jordan, the World Food Organization that last week had to stop feeding 1/3 of those people because there's not enough money to go around to buy food for them. So just how desperate those circumstances are. And so while I feel for the refugees that are making their way to Europe, it's the frail, the olds, the mothers, the children. By and large, what we see is 75% men, and of those, they largely tend to be young men. And so we need to make sure we also have a balanced response to this crisis, not just one that focuses, that's driven by the psychological effect of a picture of a 3-year-old dead child on a beach.
Janice.
So just to follow on, Steve, the people who are moving right now are the healthiest, the best equipped, the youngest to undertake an arduous journey. And we have to see that. Left behind in the country, either as displaced people or in refugee camps, are older people, women, children. And if we just stop for 1 second and on the fact that Christian just mentioned, the World Food Program had to stop feeding these people in refugee camps because countries like ours are not giving enough money.
So that's one thing we could do right away.
That is astounding to me. And that's not to diminish the important work that Alexandra's doing in galvanizing this country to sponsor refugee families. But an immediate need is to provide minimal rations, food and clean drinking water in refugee camps. And governments, they are short 2/3. That's an immediate thing we could do.
Francisco.
But also, you see the large number of people are men, because in the Civil War are fight in the vast majority by young men. And they are forced recruited. They are escaping for forced recruitment, for violence, for many things. The people that are killed first in these conflicts are young men. So in that case, the push factor is there. So, and the gender component, we have to analyze it in that particular way. Of course, we have to have special policies and programs to try to help the people that don't have the energy, don't have the money, don't have the resources to escape from that particular situation. Of course we have, but we have to have a holistic approach. This is a civil war. This is a society that is in the run, and run everybody. And who runs better, you know, who runs, yeah, exactly.
But let's not diminish the fact that we also are aware that sometimes only one family member can make the trip.
Exactly.
Right. And sometimes you send the strongest person out there to try and help I mean, that's what the Kurdi family said, that the one older brother went with the hopes that he could bring the rest of his family later on because those vulnerable people can't move.
You need that hawk.
And Francisco, last word to you. Those who still have distrust for this situation, what do you want to say to them?
This country changed people. You know, when I came to Canada, I was part of a civil war. The violence was surrounding me. I didn't know if I am going to go back to my house alive. My kids were threatened. My friends were kidnapped. My friends were killed. Look who I am, a very peaceful person, trying to do as best as I can to help this country to react to situations like I faced when I was young. So I think the person deserves a chance. And it's not possible to say, you were this and this, you don't have a chance. Give them a chance, and they will prove me right every single time. I work with those people. I work with refugees. I work with people that have been accused of many things. Let them a chance, and they will build this country way much better.
This process of bad blood rising between Ontario and Ottawa began under Mike Harris. Mike Harris was vehement in his attacks on the federal government many times during his domain. He exported, or there were refugees from his government in the person of 3 very senior ministers to Ottawa, Tony Clement, Jim Flaherty, and John Baird, each of whom, as soon as they arrived in Ottawa, started attacking Ottawa. And Flaherty, to my surprise, made it a constant refrain. So this battle has its roots in a struggle that was launched by Ontario Conservatives against Ottawa. So to that extent, Ms. Wynne's carrying on a tradition, I don't think appropriately, that was started elsewhere. But look forward from here. Let's talk about the 20th of October or next February. It's important, no matter what the outcome of the federal election is, that we get back to a more sane, a more Canadian, if you will, place in federal-provincial relations where premiers and the First Minister of Canada meet regularly to discuss national issues. And that isn't advanced by Ms. Wynne's behavior either. That's what really makes me unhappy about this.
Siri, I want to go back even further than Robin Sears just went back, and that is in the 1970s and 1980s, people may not remember it, but the Premier of the day, Bill Davis, was out there campaigning hard for Joe Clark in 79 and 80, and for Brian Mulroney in 1984. What Kathleen Wynne is doing is no different than what Bill Davis did, but now it seems to be a bigger deal. How come?
I don't remember the early 80s quite as well as these gentlemen do.
I'm older than you.
Thanks for the question, though.
No, but
no, and I think that's the thing, is it's not unprecedented, it's not unusual. I think people from all levels of government have always done it. I think it's interesting the amount of press that Premier Wynne has gotten, and I think that Harper's exploiting that as well. I think it works to his advantage, it works to her advantage, but I think you're absolutely right. I think people do it all the time. Naheed Nenshi yesterday.
Is any other premier doing it?
Well, you know what, it's interesting. Naheed Nenshi yesterday, who's a mayor, called out Chris Alexander, the Minister of Immigration,
any other premier doing it?
But that doesn't, to me, actually make it wrong. I think the Premier of Ontario is actually a very brave, very intelligent, and very politically savvy woman. I think one of the things she actually has hugely in common with the Prime Minister is that everything that they do is political. Everything they do is for a reason. And if she's doing it, she thinks it's going to help her.
So, Robin, let's ask the follow-up question. If other premiers aren't doing it, why aren't they doing it? Because we know some of them, in their heart of hearts, feel the same way Premier Wynne does about this Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Because it is not in their political interest to do it. There is no upside for the premiers of Manitoba, Quebec, or British Columbia in playing a stake about the outcome of the next federal election. The more important thing to do, and what the more mature provincial governments do, is to provide their political machinery behind the scenes in support of their federal cousins.
And she's doing that as well.
In the case of Ontario, there's a huge number of Ontario New Democrats who are working in Ottawa and Toronto and elsewhere, but Ms. Horwath, I think, is wisely keeping her public counsel to herself. What will happen after the election, I think, if there is anybody elected other than Mr. Harper, is there will be a movement to convene a kind of Confederation of Tomorrow style conference. Ms. Wynne may or may not be at the center of the organizing group for that, depending on how people feel about her performance in this campaign.
See, I think it's really sad, just to jump in there, I think it's really sad that we can acknowledge that other premiers can feel the same way, but we characterize it as immature for an elected leader to say what she thinks during an election. It's an important election, and she feels strongly about it. And I think that that's actually a huge sign of leadership, to say, I don't care how this plays out politically. I think this is important. I think he's doing a bad job, and it's having an impact on people's lives.
When you are the student trustee at trustee meetings, do you get the sense that people take what you say seriously?
I'm part of Halton Catholic, so I think that our board does a really great job of listening to us and taking us seriously as people and as people at the table. But I've heard other stories from other trustees that they kind of have a different experience and they're still viewed as students. But in my opinion, I think that if the government really wanted us to have a strong voice, they'd give us a binding vote, because as of right now, we have a non-binding vote.
You can't vote,
right? We can't vote, so we can't, although we're here to speak on students, we can't really make that an action. We can't really say that we don't agree with it by voting or not voting. So I think if the government right now really wants to take that extra step and give students the voice that we're supposed to be given, they would give us these binding votes.
Do you think, Doretta, that parents have an adequate say over what happens in education today in Ontario?
Well, to a certain extent they do. They get to choose what neighborhood they live in, what school they're going to send their children to. Beyond that, they don't really have a lot. The school advisory councils were well-intended, but I think they lost a lot of their sizzle. I think they lost a lot of their their intended control to monitor what's going on.
Not influential?
No, they're not that influential. They ended up, in many cases, I'm sure there's exceptions to this, but in many cases ended up reverting to the old style PTA fundraising body, even though they're in law and regulation, it says their main function is to monitor student achievement in the school. And I don't see a lot of that happening.
Why not?
Because there's no accountability. There really is no accountability. If, first of all, parent councils are just purely advisory, so they have no control over who the principal is, who the staff is, what gets taught at that school. Everything, of course, is mandated from the ministry on down. But they don't. There isn't any consequence in accountability if things don't improve at that school. If the student achievement isn't improving, if there's nothing that happens no incentive to do that, then nothing happens. There's no consequence. There's no accountability.
And let me go to you on this, because as we try to better understand who's sort of responsible for making sure that our students are well educated, of course, at the end of the day, it gets back to the teacher. Should it? Are you ultimately responsible, you as teachers, for making sure that our children are well educated?
We're the ones who are the gatekeepers of what goes on in education delivery in the classrooms in Ontario.
But are you ultimately responsible?
Ultimately responsible for delivering the curriculum that's passed down to us. The unfortunate part is recently we've had so many initiatives and so many things happen, and there's been a lot of stresses within the education system that has become increasingly difficult with the workload. We've been asked to do way more with a lot less, and it's becoming very difficult in the classroom. And I go to what Chloe said. The communication between the student and the teacher in the classroom, and also the trustees and the student governments within each school, is critically important in finding out how the students react to the things that are going on in the school and the new delivery of new curriculum, so that we can then inform our practice and change so that students get the education they need and they deserve.
I know the Minister of Education is fond of saying, and I forget the number, but it's something probably like $26 billion a year. We're spending, is it 26, something like that?
I think it's about 23, 22.7.
Okay, okay.
Like that, yeah.
Still, that's a lot of money.
It is.
That's a lot of money. So when you say we're being asked to do more with less,
well,
$22 billion and change sounds like a lot of money.
Well, if you look at the funding, there's problems there, and this goes back to former governments. And the reality was some of the changes that were made to the system. We're struggling with, the government's struggling with the funding formula, let's be honest. When it gets to the school boards, what gets down to the classroom is what is really concerning me. Funding has to be more targeted to classroom needs and classroom management and delivery of program, rather than management level at the top level.
Marit, who is ultimately responsible for making sure our children get a good education?
Well, I do think that ultimately the provincial government, who controls where the funding goes and what the curriculum is and how everything is structured, is ultimately responsible. That's what elections are for. Elections are change agents. That's where democracy comes in. And the public, who ultimately are the impetus behind our education system, they can make decisions about who's in charge and making those decisions at the top. I would say I do agree with a lot of the other panelists that we've seen changes over many years here in this province that have kind of chipped away at funding for education. And even when you talk about things like parent involvement and school advisory councils, that kind of thing, and the fact that they're so focused on fundraising, why is that? It's because we're not properly funding many aspects of our education system, things that matter to families, to communities, to kids, and how they learn. I mean, if you've got, and I totally agree that we have to put the money into the classroom and what's happening there in the education. But if you've got a leak over your head while you're trying to learn, it makes it really challenging. And I think that a lot of school councils and parents are becoming very active and involved in the advocacy, which I think is important, unfortunately, because we've just seen systemic underfunding of our education system now. And I think the current,
how far?
Oh, well, I mean, I think we've had, probably could go way back. I'm sure we've never adequately funded education, but we certainly, under this government, have seen an unwillingness to change the education funding formula, which everybody will tell you has been the problem for a long time.
There's tons of money in the system, but is it adequately being put into the classroom?
Well, I've been involved in the education debate at different levels for, I guess, maybe, oh my God, 20 years. And you know what? There has never been a day when a school board chair or a union leader stood up and said to the Minister of Education, "Thank you, we have enough." And I think that, are there funding pressures? Of course there are funding pressures. There have always been funding pressures. There always will be funding pressures. And until we start to shift the debate into what's the student outcome we want and how do we get there? Because just throwing more money at it, I mean, the current government has thrown a lot of money at the education system, gazillions more, quite literally, and there's fewer students.
Not literally.
Literally, gazillions. No. Anyway, that's a technical term, Steve.
Billions, literally.
Yeah, billions. Yes, there are funding pressures, and yes, there are questions about where the money goes and what you use it for, et cetera. But this cannot continue to be just a debate about gimme, more money. There's got to be more about how it's used. And the funding formula was designed, and again, I can't speak to its current format, but it was originally designed to be transparent for taxpayers and parents and teachers and everybody about here's where the money goes. It was to give the provincial government the levers to put more money where there was need. So, for example, school boards that had long distances, more buses would get the money for that. School boards that had more needs in terms of their population, let's say socioeconomic needs or whatever, could get more money for that. So that was the principles behind it, and it also was to show and track and drive money to the classroom so that you were dealing with what kids needed in a classroom, what teachers needed in a classroom, so that you had that. So that was the original intent of it, and I think is still the right policy for how you want to fund education.
Ted, does teachers having the right to strike focus everybody's attention and therefore more effectively get everybody to the finish line ultimately?
I'm not sure whether the language of efficiency is necessarily the best way to frame it. I think the bigger question is that we probably wouldn't get to the end goal in the end if teachers weren't there as professional members negotiating along with other partners like government and the ratepayers.
I'm just going to say that I think we're mixing two things up here.
Okay.
Professionalism and being a professional is different than being sort of in a union shop floor model. A professional definition of a professional is putting public interest first. So it actually means that you actually sometimes don't get something or don't ask for something because the public interest is more important than your personal interest. So there's a difference, and I think we have to be careful.
Sight of that?
Yeah, I do. I think so. Yeah.
What's really fascinating about that is this Revel committee, which was considered by the teachers to be a reviled report in the end, actually said that exact same thing, that professionalism amongst teachers means that they basically don't need to go on strike because they put the public interest ahead of their own, and so they shouldn't have the right to anyway.
2 minutes to go.
Okay,
Anne, can you respond?
I'm going to, there's a couple of things, because
Okay.
that's really quite interesting. Yeah. One of the key things I'm going to go to is teachers are parents and taxpayers too.
Absolutely.
Okay, which tends to sometimes get put out there as if we've got this agenda. The reality is the right to strike is an integral part of the bargaining process, and I'm going to go to what Ted said. That's what ultimately, unfortunately, gets maybe the final piece at the end to get you to an agreement. But it is a necessity, it is a basic right. The teachers and the education system in this province are some of the best in the world. And we're there because we have the judgment, we have the professional autonomy.
But if a government in its wisdom thought, you guys are so essential to the future of this province because you're educating our children, therefore we can't let you go on strike, we need to take that right away, what would the reaction be?
Then you'd go to the problem that Ms. Eckert talked about, the fact that what happens when you go to that binding arbitration and you get the OPP, and what happens from there, and you go there. I think this system is working. Is it perfect? No. But the bottom line is, I know that there are other sectors that are not as high as we are in some instances. You referred to them. Bottom line is, this is not about a race to the bottom. This is about bringing everybody up to the same level.
Whoever said it was a race to the bottom, and whoever said it was an argument about efficiency, what it is, it's about how do we help our students learn better? How do we take the resources that we have and apply them where that makes the most sense? And that means give and take on all sides, and it means putting the students' interest, really putting the students' interest above and beyond everybody else's interest. And I got to tell you, Steve, I have just seen so many times when that doesn't happen in the system, and it's not fair to kids, and it's certainly not fair to hardworking frontline teachers.
And I would disagree, absolutely, because I honestly believe that as a teacher union, as a leader, my first focus is the teachers in the classroom, and that directly relates to every student in every classroom. In this
But
process.
that's the difference. It doesn't. It doesn't.
10 seconds, Ted.
Go
Well,
ahead, Ted.
I just think we've been drowning in rhetoric for a long time. Like putting students first, who could disagree with that? That's a real great slogan, but it doesn't mean anything unless we've sat down collectively. And maybe it is time in Ontario that we do this. Bring together all of the stakeholders and ask, what is an education for?
I have another slogan.
Yeah.
Time has run out.
I love it.
Thanks, everybody. Ted Christou from Queen's University, Janet Ecker, the former education minister, and Hawkins, OECTA. Great to have you all on TVO tonight. Thanks so much. You write, there may never have been a politician elected to high office so temperamentally unsuited to it as Stephen Harper. How so?
He is a deeply introverted man. You talked about his father and his three brothers. Joe Harper had a profound influence on his sons. And one of those influences was temperament, because Joe Harper was a deeply introverted man. And I interviewed Robert Harper, Stephen's brother, who is also introverted. And Stephen Harper himself is a very closed person, a person who has difficulty handling crowds, who has difficulty handling other people, for that matter, who does not like travel, who does not like to have his routine disrupted, who likes to wake up in the same place at the same time and eat the same meals. These are not qualities that we associate with politicians. And so he has struggled against that his entire political life, trying to fit his own inclinations and his own nature into the job that he's found himself in.
He did what a lot of kids hope to do when they graduate from high school, and that is, you know, if you're good enough, you go to Trinity College at the University of Toronto. He tried that. How did that work out?
Well, and that, to my mind, and in the biography, is the single most important thing that happened to him in his life. He lasted 2 weeks, maybe 3. Here we had a smart kid from a middle-class suburban family, the first of his family to go to university. He met the sons and daughters of the Central Canadian elite at that closed private institution of Trinity College, and he fled from it. Not only did he flee from it, I mean, he was in a state. His father phoned a friend in Calgary, in Edmonton, and said, my son just quit school. I don't know what to do with him. Have you got a job for him? And Gord Shaw said, yeah, we got a job in the mailroom. So by the end of that week, Steve Harper had left Ontario, had gone to Edmonton, and was working as a clerk in a mailroom at Imperial Oil. And he did it for 3 years. 3 years. Imagine someone as smart as Stephen Harper working in a clerical job for 3 years. But he was that lost, he was that traumatized, and he was that determined that he wouldn't go back to university until he knew why he was going back and what he was going to do with it. It speaks both to the sense of alienation and trauma that experience imposed on him, and also to the strength of will that he was going to get through it, but he was going to get through it on his terms.
As the second oldest of 10, can you talk to us about why that may or may not have been significant during his formative years?
Well, he sure thinks it's significant, and so do all his friends. It's almost always the first thing that people who know him well bring up about him. And there's a few things about that. I spoke with his younger sister a few years ago, and she said that one thing that was a factor in their household growing up is that their parents relied on the oldest siblings, including Tom, to sort of take care of the younger ones. So they all have memories of Tom, you know, reading stories to them at bedtime, helping them with schoolwork, and even later on, giving them life advice as they were getting going. So he's a guy who I think took on a lot of that type of responsibility really earlier than I think would typically think of kids doing today, or of kids doing in the smaller families that are more the norm these days.
As a person who grew up in Quebec at a certain time, one assumes that religion had an important part in his life. Did it?
It sure did. He was in a devout Catholic household. He remembers going to Mass before school on weekdays when he was a kid. And maybe even more important than that, there's a sort of a direct linkage between the religious life of the family and the sort of early political life of Tom Mulcair. He had a mentor in high school, Father Alan Cox, who got kids interested in sort of left Catholic progressive activities, you know, going to help people in the poorer parts of Montreal, that sort of thing. So there's a sort of an easy transition, I think, in Mr. Mulcair's own memories of his childhood between, you know, what was religious life and what was political life. He thinks of them as having been bound together.
Bound together, okay, but usually in every politician's life there's that moment where the light bulb goes on and they say, aha, I'm going into politics. Did he have that kind of aha moment?
He says he did. He was 14. He's told me in an interview, I think he's mentioned it elsewhere. When I asked him why at 14, the explanation he gave was quite interesting. He said in their busy household with all those kids around the table, one way that you got to be part of the adult conversation was by talking politics. His parents both came from liberal families, had liberal backgrounds. You mentioned in your intro, on his mother's side, he's descended from prominent liberals in Quebec, liberal premiers. So politics was being talked about, and as a kid, he found, you know, we're thinking about here a kid who was sort of in a hurry to grow up, a way that he could be heard in the adult conversations by talking politics. And you know, he thinks that partly as a result of that, he thought, hey, this is something I'd like to do. So at 14, he starts saying he wants to be a politician.
I want to hit the biggest criticism that we often hear about Justin Trudeau right on the head, right off the top. Namely, that he's a rock star, he connects extremely well with people, but he's not that smart and he's not ready for the job. What's your view on that, having written a book about him?
You know, it's always difficult to say, you know, he really is smart, because especially in this hyper-partisan atmosphere that Ottawa has been these last few years, any defense of Justin Trudeau is seen as partisanship. But I will tell you, speaking about him as a person, he is smart, he's very clever, he's very social. As with all leaders, he's not entirely what you see in front of the camera. You know, the camera distorts everybody's personality a little bit, but Justin Trudeau in private is a little sharper, a little edgier, a little sarcastic, but he's definitely quite smart.
Let's talk for a moment about his childhood, because of course, of anybody who's ever run for Prime Minister, you know, he grew up at 24 Sussex Drive. No one else can say that. Did he have anything resembling a normal childhood?
I think his father was very careful to give him a pretty normal childhood. And remember, I think the biggest event in their lives was the split up of the family. And Margaret Trudeau moved into the neighborhood, not far away from 24 Sussex, but there are stories of Trudeau wheeling his bike around New Edinburgh neighborhood, trying to escape the RCMP. I guess that's not normal for. But I do think that that his father was careful to try to bring them up with their mother, their father, as best they could over a broken home, and give them a reasonably normal childhood. I think it was more growing up as the son of Pierre Trudeau, not necessarily Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, that would be the unusual part. He was an older man, very demanding of his kids in terms of athletics, books, intellect. So I think that was the big challenge.
But if I remember,
will say too.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I will say too that it's worth reading Margaret Trudeau's books, especially her book on mental illness, to see what Justin Trudeau might have been growing up with. There's a part in his own biography where he's talking about being at school, playing dodgeball, and he's pulled out of class to come and deal with his mother, who has fallen apart and is weeping because her boyfriend has broken up with her. And the recollection in the biography, Justin's biography, ends with, "I was 11 years old."
You did a piece on her, Anne, several years ago, the headline of which was, "Could the Queen of Green be mean?" And let's start there. That seems like a good question. She seems like most of the time one of the sunnier personalities up on Parliament Hill. She got a mean streak in her anywhere?
Well, in my defense, I did not write the headline, and I don't think I ever used the word mean in the story. However, the piece does look into a very complex personality. The sunny side is the one the public is familiar with, but she is a far more complex individual, and I spoke with people who saw another side of her that, if not mean, was difficult to deal with occasionally.
Tell me more. What's that other side we don't tend to see?
Well, I think when I wrote the piece, the timing is important here. It was in 2007. She had been nominated the leader of the Green Party by big acclamation, but she was dealing with a party that was in a fractious state. On one side, people didn't know whether they were a social movement, a political party. She came from an activist background, and that very much informed her politicking, as did her previous kind of government involvement. So there was a lot of people didn't like her style. They thought she was too much of a grandstander, that she was too autocratic, that she wasn't going with the flow, and she was doing what she needed to do at the point to make the Green Party a viable political party.
And she has, in fairness, put it on the map. I mean, she really has.
She certainly put herself on the map, and in the process, I think the party has come with her.
Oh, okay, that's an interesting distinction. Has she put herself on the map or the party on the map?
I think both. I think that the two have become synonymous, which is, I think, an issue within the Green Party itself. For instance, one of her first big, bold moves, and this is a woman, let's remember, she comes from a position of having done hunger strikes in front of the House of Commons in the past. She's very good she's a media magnet, and one of the first things she did when she was the leader of the party was run against Peter MacKay, which in central Nova Scotia, long-held Tory stronghold, MacKay stronghold. Everybody thought it was a suicide mission, but it was canny in a way because it also got the spotlight on her, even though it didn't win a seat. So there's always been that friction within the party, and people left the party because they didn't think that she was being too strategic about getting her own name out there as opposed to actually winning seats, which is more complex.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety at tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.